There is a kind of tired that sleep cannot reach. Callum Reyes had known that kind once, in the year after his wife died, when he would lie in bed until the alarm went off and then lie there 10 minutes longer because the ceiling was easier to face than the day. That was a long time ago now. He had learned to manage it, the way you learn to manage a bad knee or a shoulder that clicks in winter. Not fixed, just worked around. Most mornings he was up before Rosie, making her lunch while the coffee brewed, ironing the specific shirt she needed for picture day, or the specific leggings she needed because the other pair felt wrong. He had become fluent in the small necessities of raising a 7-year-old alone, and there was a quiet competence to it that he had come to think of as its own kind of peace. He worked at a fleet maintenance depot on the eastern edge of Kelowna, the kind of facility that nobody drove past on purpose. 18-wheelers mostly, some refrigerated units, the occasional piece of agricultural equipment that had been pushed past its service interval by an optimistic farmer. Gordon Halstead ran the shop. He was not a bad man, exactly, but he was the kind of man who had decided early on that the most important thing about a person was whether they had the right paper on the wall, and everything else followed from that. Callum had been working there for 11 years. He had rebuilt engines that the manufacturer's service reps couldn't diagnose. He had kept rigs running through February cold snaps that would have stranded the trucks for a week otherwise. He knew what he was worth. The difficulty was that Gordon had a different accounting system. The pay was steady, the work was real. Callum was not a person who needed to be celebrated for doing his job, but there were meetings sometimes, in the small glassed-in office that smelled of burnt coffee and Gordon's aftershave, where a decision would be made about overtime rates, or about which of the mechanics would handle a new client's contract, and Callum would leave the meeting knowing that the decision had been made before anyone had sat down. He was not the one who went to trade association dinners. He was not the one who had the 2-year diploma from BC framed behind his desk. He was the one who fixed the things that needed fixing and then went home to make sure Rosie had done her reading. On a Thursday evening in late October, he drove into Kelowna proper for no specific reason other than that Rosie was at her grandmother's for the night, and the apartment felt large and too quiet, in a way it only did on nights when he noticed it. He parked on Ellis Street and walked up to a pub he had been to twice before, a place with low lighting and decent draft and the kind of ambient noise that meant you weren't sitting in silence without having to talk to anyone. He ordered a pint of something amber and found a stool at the bar and did what he sometimes did when he had an evening to himself. He sat still and let his mind go slack, which was harder than it sounded and which he had gotten better at over the years. He was most of the way through the pint when he noticed the woman at the high table near the back wall. She was not doing anything that drew attention. She was sitting across from a man in a pressed shirt who was talking with the particular energy of someone who had decided the evening was going well and wanted to confirm it. She had a glass of white wine in front of her that she had not touched in some time. She was nodding at intervals that had no relationship to what the man was saying. Callum recognized the expression. It was the expression of a person waiting for a reasonable moment to leave, and finding that the other person kept not providing one. He looked away. He finished his pint and considered whether he wanted another. He looked back at the table. The man in the pressed shirt had moved his chair around to her side of the table, closing the angle between them in a way that looked accidental and probably wasn't. The woman's hands were in her lap now. She was smiling the way people smile when they have been socialized not to cause a scene. Callum ordered a second pint he didn't particularly want. He drank about a third of it. He looked at the table once more. The man had his hand on the back of her chair. He set down his glass and walked across the room. He did not walk fast. He did not have an expression on his face that would have told you anything was wrong. When he reached the table, he said, "Hey, sorry I'm late," in the easy tone of someone who was mildly apologetic about a minor inconvenience and he looked at the woman with the specific look of someone who knows you well enough to be annoyed at you for not texting back. There was a half-second where anything could have happened. The woman looked at him. Something moved across her face. A quick calculation, or maybe just relief arriving faster than skepticism, she said. "Don't worry about it." And the two words were exactly right. Natural and a little dry, the way you'd speak to someone you'd been friends with for a long time. Callum pulled out the empty chair across from her and sat down. He did not look at the man in the pressed shirt directly. He said, "Did you already order?" As though the man were not there. The man said, "Excuse me." Callum looked at him then. He held the man's eyes with an expression that was not aggressive and not apologetic and not particularly interested, and he said, "Sorry, man. Old friends. We've been trying to find a time to catch up all week." He said it in the tone of someone explaining that the parking spot was already taken. There was a moment. The man looked at the woman. She had turned slightly in her chair toward Callum, in the way that a person turns towards someone they know, and the angle of her body said everything that needed to be said. The man in the pressed shirt stood up. He said something that was technically civil and left, and Callum watched him go to make sure he did, and then he turned back to the woman. "You don't have to stay," he said. "I can just sit here for a few minutes if that's easier." She looked at him for a moment, not the relieved look of someone who had been rescued, but the more careful look of someone trying to understand what had just happened. "You didn't have to do that?" she said. "I know. Why did you?" He thought about it genuinely the way he thought about most things, without hurrying. "You looked like you needed a reasonable out," he said, "and I had a pint I wasn't really enjoying anyway." She laughed, which he had not expected, and it changed her face entirely. She said her name was Vivienne. He said his was Callum. They talked for about 40 minutes. Not the performative talking of two people trying to impress each other, but the easy, incidental kind. About the city, about whether the winter would be bad this year, about a documentary she'd seen recently about the construction of the Confederation Bridge that she'd expected to be boring and had found herself watching to the end. He told her about Rosie, about the way Rosie had decided she wanted to learn to identify birds by their calls and had been playing recordings off her tablet at breakfast every morning for 3 weeks. Vivian laughed at that too and said she had gone through a phase at around that age where she had been determined to memorize the names of every river in Canada and that her parents had considered it evidence of a serious problem. At some point she said she should get going, and she meant it, and he walked with her to the door because they were both heading toward the exit. Outside on the sidewalk in the October air she turned and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." "No need," he said. He drove home and made himself toast because he hadn't eaten properly and sat at the kitchen table with his phone face down and felt, for the first time in a while, that the quiet in the apartment was not the heavy kind. He did not think much about Vivienne after that. She had not given him her number, and he had not asked for it, and that seemed about right. There are people you meet in the specific circumstances of a Thursday evening who are not meant to become anything further, and he had learned a long time ago not to pull at those threads. The following morning he was up at 6 to get Rosie from her grandmother's place before school. He drove the 35-kilometer round trip in the cold, made her a proper breakfast because his mother-in-law's idea of breakfast was instant oatmeal and orange juice from concentrate, and then drove back into Kelowna because he had an interview at 9. The interview was for a fleet operations supervisor position at a company called Northspan Logistics. He had found the posting 6 weeks ago and spent 2 evenings reading about the company before he applied. They moved refrigerated freight across BC and Alberta and had recently taken on a contract with a produce distributor out of the Okanagan that had apparently been more complicated than anticipated. The job was the kind of thing he was qualified to do in his sleep and had never quite been given the opportunity to. He had told Gordon about it because he did not see the point in lying about it. Gordon had said, "Good luck." in the tone of a man who did not expect luck to be necessary because he did not expect the outcome to change. The Northspan offices were on the north end of the city, in a building that was newer than Callum had expected, glass and steel. The kind of building that suggested the company was doing well enough to afford the signage. He arrived 9 minutes early, which he considered appropriate, and sat in a low chair in the reception area and looked at his hands. He was a large man with hands that showed his work. There were calluses in specific places and a scar along the base of his right thumb from a ratchet that had slipped on a frozen morning 4 years ago. He was wearing his good jacket, which was a dark gray wool blazer that he had bought for a cousin's wedding and had worn possibly 4 times since. He thought about whether the jacket was right and then decided that thinking about it further was not going to change anything. At 9:05, a door opened. The woman who walked out of it was carrying a folder and saying something back over her shoulder to someone still in the room, and she had her head half turned, and then she completed the turn and looked across the reception area and stopped. Callum stood up. They looked at each other across 12 feet of industrial carpet. Vivienne said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Oh, hi," he said. She collected herself in the way that competent people collect themselves, which was quickly and without making a production of it. She extended her hand and said, "I'm Vivienne Okoro, Director of Operations," and her voice was entirely professional, and he understood that she was telling him something about how this was going to go. "Callum Reyes," he said, and shook it. She led him into a boardroom with a long table and windows facing north toward the hills. There were 2 other people in the room, a man she introduced as the regional logistics manager, and a woman who was the head of the maintenance division. They were pleasant enough, and the interview began the way interviews begin, with the particular formality of strangers assessing each other under time pressure. He answered their questions about his qualifications and his experience, about systems he had worked with and problems he had solved, and he did not dress things up or speak in the corporate language he had heard used by people who had been to the kind of conferences he had never been sent to. He said what he had done and how he had done it and what the results had been, and he could see from the way the regional manager was making notes that it was landing the way he'd hoped. About 20 minutes in, Vivienne set down her pen. She said, "I want to ask you something that isn't on our standard list." She said it to the room as much as to him, which was a kind of courtesy. "Tell me what you would do if you saw a situation that was clearly going wrong, but that wasn't technically your responsibility to fix." The room was quiet for a moment. Callum thought about it honestly, not the way people think about interview questions, but the way he thought about actual problems. From the bottom up, from what was real, he said that it would depend on the situation. But that in his experience, the phrase, "not my responsibility," usually meant one of 2 things. Either someone was protecting their own position, or someone was waiting to be given permission. He said he had never been very good at waiting for permission when something needed doing. He said he had also learned that wading into something without knowing what you were doing could make it worse, and that the first thing he usually did was make sure he understood what was actually broken before he picked up a tool. The regional manager said, "Can you give me an example?" He gave 3. After the 3rd one, the maintenance division head said, "Where did you study?" He said he hadn't. He said he had started working in fleet maintenance at 19 and had been learning from machines and from the people who understood them ever since. There was a short silence that he did not try to fill. Vivienne said, "That's all we have scheduled for today. Thank you for coming in, Callum." He thanked them all, gathered his jacket from the back of the chair, and walked out through the reception area and through the glass front doors and stood in the parking lot for a moment in the October air. He did not know how it had gone. He had a general distrust of his own read on these things because he had been wrong before, had left rooms feeling like it had been good and then not heard back, and had left rooms feeling like he had said the wrong thing and then received an offer. He drove back across the city to the depot because he had a Kenworth cab over with a transmission issue that he'd been partway through when Gordon had let him leave early for the interview, and he changed out of his jacket in the truck cab and got back underneath the vehicle and continued the work. At 4:30, the shop phone rang. Gordon answered it and then appeared at the end of the service bay and said, "Call for you," with an expression that Callum couldn't read. He took the phone. Vivienne Okoro said, "Is this a good time?" He looked at his hands, which were not clean. "It's fine," he said. She said that the committee had discussed it and that there were some concerns about his formal credentials and that they had talked through those concerns at some length. She said that she had herself argued that there were different kinds of knowledge and that the kind developed over 20 years of working on actual machines in actual conditions was not a kind that could be dismissed without a very good reason. She said that they were offering him the position. He was quiet for a moment. "Callum?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "Sorry, I'm here." "Do you want some time to think about it?" "No," he said. "I'll take it." There was a pause, and then she said, in a voice that was still professional but that had something underneath it, "I want you to know that what you told me in the interview about not waiting for permission, that was the thing. For me, that was the thing." He said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said she would have the offer documents sent by end of week. He hung up the phone and stood in the depot office for a moment, with the smell of oil and cold metal around him. And through the window he could see the flat northern light falling across the yard and the trucks parked in a row. And he thought about Rosie at school right now, probably in the middle of reading period, probably thinking about birds. He thought about what to tell her when she got home. He thought he would tell her straight, the way he told her most things, that he was going to a new job, that it was a better job, that he had worked for it, and it had worked out. He would not tell her about the bar, about the woman, about the strange coincidence of it, because she was 7 and the story would confuse her, and because, when he thought about it, the story wasn't really about that. The story was about a man who had done what seemed right on a Thursday night because it was right, and about a woman who had done what seemed fair the following morning because it was fair, and the fact that those two things had happened to involve the same two people was either a very tidy coincidence or the universe demonstrating, in its low-key way, that decency occasionally gets to keep its receipts. He drove to pick up Rosie at 4. She got in the car with her backpack and her hair half out of the elastic she'd put it in that morning, and a look on her face that meant something had happened at school, and he asked her what, and she said that a boy in her class had said that bird calls were a boring thing to be interested in. "What did you say?" Callum asked. She buckled her seatbelt with great precision. "I told him that boring was just a word people used when they didn't understand something." He pulled out of the parking lot. "That's exactly right," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the late afternoon light on the hills. "Dad," she said, "do you think I could get a real bird book, not just the app?" "Yeah," he said. "I think we can do that." She nodded satisfied and turned back to the window, and he drove them both home through the early dark of the October evening, and the quiet in the car was the good kind, the kind that didn't need filling, the kind that was just two people going in the same direction without needing to say so.